Slavery, condition in which one human being was owned by another. A slave was considered by law as property or chattel, and was deprived of most of the rights ordinarily held by free persons.
One of the myths of history is the South was responsible for slavery in America. The northern colonies of Massachusetts and Connecticut were the first to legalize slavery. North Carolina and Georgia were the last. Northern and foreign merchants were responsible for the brutal importation of African slaves to this country. They made millions. Not one southern vessel imported slaves. When the U.S. Constitution was signed, all 13 states held slaves. When northern slave owners and industrialists discovered that it was cheaper to hire poor European immigrants rather than to care for slaves, they didn't free their slaves. They sold them to the South and made millions again. When some northern states outlawed slavery, they also passed laws forbidding them from living in the North. So let's set the record straight. The institution of slavery was started by the northern states and was responsible for the profiteering and importation of the slaves. When they had no use for their slaves, they sold their slaves and then outlawed them. Imagine
Between 16th and 19th century, over 13 million slaves were taken from Africa. They were kidnapped by slave traders and marched to the sea. Bound with iron shackles and driven by the sting of the whip. Slaves were packed into the decks by hundreds. In the Americas, slaves were sold at auctions. Families were torn apart forever. Slaves were forced to give up their language and culture and adopt white customs. Whole families of slaves lived in tiny dirt floor sheds of poor quality. Most slaves worked in the fields in the scorching heat and freezing cold. Some slaves were house servants, which means that they lived in better conditions, sometimes castrated. Family, religion, and culture helped slaves cope with their harshness of life. Slaves sang spirituals, told African folk tales, and performed rhythmic dances. The music of Africans is still heard in American popular music today. Despite community ties, slaves often tried to escape from bondage. Few actually made it out of the South because bounty hunters were out there. The underground lottery helped hundreds, perhaps thousands, of slaves to escape. It was a system of safe houses for runaways, so the slaves could reach free Canada. The most famous conductor was Harriet Tubman, who helped 300 slaves to escape. There was one story about a slave who hit himself nailed in a box too long. The biggest fear White had was slave uprising or severe insurrection. The most violent slave uprising in U.S. history was Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Turner led an uprising in Virginia that ended with 60 whites and 100 blacks dead. There were 4 million slaves in the USA.
By the late 1700s, British slavers were capturing as many as 50,000 Africans each year and taking them to the Americas. So how did this enslavement of Africans come to an end? In the United States, it would take a civil war. In the British Empire, it would take a movement that included a man named William Wilberforce. While slavers were seeking slaves in Africa in the late 1700s, William Wilberforce was living in luxury in his family's estates in London and Wimbledon. Then he spent a few years gambling and dining with friends on the finest foods at college in Cambridge. Years earlier, he'd been fascinated by a young preacher named George Whitefield, but now all he wanted was a seat in the British Parliament. In 1780, when he was only 21 years old, Wilberforce got his position in Parliament. During his early years of service, William, in his own words, did nothing to any purpose. My own distinction was my darling object. Then in 1785, while on a trip across Europe, the emptiness of William's plush life began to gnaw at his soul. Finally, in the spring of 1786, following months of dark depression, William Wilberforce trusted Jesus Christ alone to transform his troubled soul. As a new believer, he thought about abandoning his political position, but John Newton, the ex-slave trader who had penned the hymn Amazing Grace, urged Wilberforce to use his parliamentary position for the glory of God. A few months later, Wilberforce received a letter urging him to work to end British slave trafficking, and he began to turn his efforts toward this goal. Now, despite his personal charm, Wilberforce was a clumsy political strategist at times. He and his friend Thomas Clarkson introduced legislation to limit the slave trade in 1789, 1791, 1792, 93, 97, 98, 99, 1804, and 1805, only to be defeated every time. Opposition to Wilberforce became so fierce that one friend feared he would be barbecued by African merchants and eaten by Guinea captains. Finally, in 1807, the efforts of Wilberforce and Clarkson combined with the news of a slave uprising on an island known as Haiti to turn the tide. Parliament outlawed the slave trade in the British Empire. The circle around Wilberforce then turned their efforts toward abolishing slavery itself. Poor health forced Wilberforce to resign from Parliament, but Clarkson and others continued this campaign. In July of 1833, 3 days before William Wilberforce died, it became clear that they had the votes they needed to end slavery in the British Empire. The next month, the House of Lords passed the Slavery Abolition Act. 30 years later, slaves were emancipated in the United States as well. Christians rightly celebrate the impact of faith on the abolition of African slavery, but it's important never to forget that slavery didn't go away in the 19th century. In fact, in the opening decades of the 21st century, at least 12 million human beings live in slavery. Each year, more than 500,000 men, women, and children are transported as slaves across international borders. 70% are female, half are minors. May God raise up a new generation of men and women like William Wilberforce to bring an end to slavery in this century as well.
It ought to concern every person because it is a debasement of our common humanity. It ought to concern every community because it tears at our social fabric. It ought to concern every business because it distorts markets. It ought to concern every nation because it endangers public health and fuels violence and organized crime. I'm talking about the injustice, the outrage of human trafficking, which must be called by its true name, modern slavery. Now, I do not use that word slavery lightly. It evokes, obviously, one of the most painful chapters in our nation's history. But around the world, there's no denying the awful reality. When a man desperate for work finds himself in a factory or on a fishing boat or in a field, working, toiling for little or no pay and beaten if he tries to escape, that is slavery. When a woman is locked in a sweatshop or trapped in a home as a domestic servant, alone and abused, and incapable of leaving, that's slavery. When a little boy is kidnapped, turned into a child soldier, forced to kill or be killed, that's slavery. When a little girl is sold by her impoverished family, girls my daughter's age, runs away from home or is lured by the false promise of a better life and then imprisoned in a brothel and tortured if she resists, that's slavery. It is barbaric and it is evil and it has no place in a civilized world. Now, as a nation, we've long rejected such cruelty. Just a few days ago, we marked the 150th anniversary of a document that I have hanging in the Oval Office, the Emancipation Proclamation. With the advance of Union forces, it brought a new day, that all persons held as slaves would thenceforth be forever free. We wrote that promise into our Constitution. We spent decades struggling to make it real. We joined with other nations in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights so that slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms.